share your knowledge and wisdom with us. And we'll start off with just you reading a little bit of your work, if that works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. I'm impressed that this is just, I thought it was more than a semester old, but what a great thing. It's really, we, on the sort of faculty end of the department, it's really appreciated, because I think one of the great things about being in workshops is the community that forms when you're reading each other's work and you're getting to know people through their work, and then to have a larger place where you can see the same people again and meet new people is super helpful. So, good. I'm going to read the first story in this book, Woeful Creatures, because it's short and it's fun to read out loud. And then we'll talk. It's called Death Watch. And the premise of this, and this will kind of maybe lead the way for some of my belief systems about writing, is to kind of use anything as a jumping point that you possibly can, and not to feel afraid to just grab at random straws, because you want to sort of let your mind go to unexpected places. And if left to the blank page, I think most of us will kind of go to our usual spot. And if thrown simply a word, we'll suddenly veer somewhere completely different. And that's where the element of surprise can come in, and where a writer can discover things on the page. And that can be really thrilling. So this one was me thinking about jokes, because jokes always start with like a kind of story premise. And what if I started with a sort of premise of a joke, and then instead of feeling like I had to go to a punchline, just followed through in the story? And that felt really liberating for me, to kind of use that quick pace. So that lets you know kind of my starting point for this. 10 men go to 10 doctors. All the doctors tell all the men that they only have 2 weeks left to live. 5 men cry. 3 men rage. 1 man smiles. The last man is silent, meditative. Okay, he says. He has no reaction. The raging men, upon meeting in the lobby, don't know what to do with the man of no reaction. They fall upon him and kill him with their bare hands. The doctor comes out of his office and apologizes to the dead man. Dang it, he says sheepishly to his colleagues. Look like I got the date wrong again. One can't account for murder or accident, says another doctor in his bright white coat. The raging, sad men and the smiling man all leave the office. The smiling man does not know why he is smiling. He just feels relieved. He was suicidal anyway. Now it's out of his hands. The others growl at him, their bare hands blood-specked, but the smiler is eerie in his relief, and so they let him be, thinking that he might somehow speed up their precious 2 weeks. The raging men tear out the door first. The crying men follow. On their way, they meet up with a field of cows. The cows are chewing quietly and calmly. The sight of the cows fills the crying men with sadness, as they only have 2 weeks left to look at cows. But the sight of the cows fills the raging men with more rage. After all, why are cows so calm? Why is it that cows get to remain ignorant of their own death? Why is the sky so blue and peaceful? The raging men run to the cows, but the cows don't notice. The cows want more than anything just to continue chewing. One raging man collapses in the field and drums it with his fists. The others run and run. The 5 crying men stand at the fence, crying. Look at the sad and large rage of the doomed men, they think. Who knew a cow was so beautiful? Why was I not a farmer? Why not a field hand? Why an office building? Back at the office building, the doctors check their notebooks and discover an error. Oops, only 2 of the 5 crying men need to be crying. The other 3 are in perfect health. The doctors, embarrassed, call up their patients, who are by then crying into the arms of their crying wives or lovers or pets. We have some good news, they say. We made a goof. You seem to be in perfect health. Very sorry about that. One crying man, new lease on life, moves his family to the countryside where they raise goats. The other 2 go back to their regular routines. A close call. The last raging man still is drumming his fists on the field. His lover calls out into the darkness of the night. The lover understands that his angry man is out there raging against the world again. This is to be expected, but he does not understand why the doctor keeps calling. The suicidal one is another error, but he's impossible to contact. He has flown by now to Greece and is trying finally to have a relationship. With only a couple of weeks left, he thinks that for once he has a good chance of having someone by his bedside when he dies. The 2 remaining crying men die, one with tubes, the other in his own bed. One of the raging men dies, roaring in the bathtub. Another, though not a mistake, still drums that field with his fists. The very energy it takes should drain him dry, but no, he's happily drumming. He drums for weeks and sits up and isn't yet dead. It takes him 6 months, which he uses to make some angry paintings that are beloved by people in galleries who are unaware that they themselves are angry at all. The Greek woman sobs when she hears that her wonderful melancholy lover will be dying soon. They do ritual after ritual. Their sex is like castles. It has moats and turrets. If only, thinks the suicidal man, if only I had known for longer how short it all would be. Everybody says this. They say it for us, the non-dying, to remember our daily lives. But we can't fully get it until we're right up in the face of it. Can we get it? It's hard to get. I do not get it. Only the suicidal man gets it here, and his Greek lover with her aquiline nose. On the morning of the 3rd week, the Greek woman returns to her bedroom with a bouquet of morning flowers. She has prepared herself on the walk over for the cold body. She can still feel him inside her. In the bedroom, her lover says hello. He feels curiously fine. The Greek woman falls to her knees and calls him a miracle. They have miracle sex in honor of miracles. But the next day happens the same, and both are giddy with joy, tinged by the slightest bit of disappointment, which they hide behind their love and delight. And then the next day, and soon the sex is not the same as before. No longer a castle, now just a hut. The Greek woman's husband is due back soon anyway from his voyage to get silk from China. The suicidal man goes to the sea to bathe. Some cows walk by chewing. He can feel his heart like the strongest machine, and his deathbed side fading. He takes the plane back home and gets off at the layover city, a city he does not know. He'd bought himself a return ticket, even though he'd assumed, even hoped he would die in Greece among clean-washed buildings and simple color contrast that is enough to satisfy everything. White on blue, yellow on blue, red on white. He had planned on giving his return ticket to his Greek lover in case she needed to escape her husband and set up a new life in America. She was not thrilled, though, by his generous offer. "Thank you," she'd said, "but I do not like this television all the time." The stopover from Athens is in Denver, not what he pictured, a place he's never been. He grew up elsewhere, not in or by mountains. So. Let's walk over the streets, he says to himself, and the first for rent sign he sees, he takes. He does everything the minute he thinks it. That is all except suicide. He does not want to be cheated of his terminal illness. His illness is not terminal. It is temporary instead. He never speaks to the doctors who try to leave a message but discover that the mechanical lady is now answering his phone. But he figures it out on his own. He thinks possibly he's one of those people who will live forever, but when he cuts himself shaving, he bleeds so profusely he spells out mortal in the sink's basin with his blood. He joins a gym. The world of Denver fills him up with coffee in the morning and walks in the afternoon. He is spending all his money. Eventually, he calls his doctor because he's too curious. He explains to the secretary how he was told he had 2 weeks to live, and now it's 3 years later. The doctor, he hears, has died. From guilt, perhaps? No, the doctor was in a skiing accident. You can't account for events like that, he says to himself, going outside to appreciate the simple color contrast of Colorado. Brown on blue, green on brown. It feels like a trade-off, even though it wasn't. He returns to his hometown the next day. There he finds the doctor's wife and life, and he seduces her with his depressive charm. He's a good new step-parent. One afternoon, the Greek woman shows up on his doorstep. "I have left my husband," she says. "I miss you, my darling, and your delicate fingertips." He is brimming with abundance, but it's too late for all of them. When the bomb hits, the doctors shake their heads at each other as their bodies disintegrate. You can never account, they say, for murder or for accidents. They are all, at once, at each other's deathbeds. Such a dark ending. Anyway, I was like, oh, how does this one end again? Oh, God, they all die. Oh, no. Anyway, different resonances at different times, too. I wrote that probably 15 years ago, so it does feel different. There weren't husbands. That also is something I noticed. It was their wives, but I didn't write husbands because gay marriage was not legal, but he had a lover. It's just I would write husbands now, which is really nice, actually, to feel that. But at the time, that wasn't an option, so anyway.
Thank you, that
You're
was
welcome.
really cool. I think that what we're all wondering is because you're so talented with writing, when did you first, let's go back to the beginning, when did you first realize that you loved writing and you wanted to commit yourself to writing?
I loved writing as a kid. I get very interested in wanting to hear all of your stories too in this, but to put forward mine, I loved writing as a kid, but I have an older sister who's a writer. And the way it kind of worked in my family is that it was just, she sort of owned writing, so I kind of wrote on the side, but I never felt like it was mine. And because of that, I sort of never really thought it was going to be a path that I took. It was just hers, it belonged to her. And so, and she's a published writer as well, like she had her own and has her own pathway. But for me then it was kind of like fishing around to try to find something else, but I kept returning to writing. And in college I went to USC, and it was the lit writing major, which was very similar to the creative writing emphasis here. And I loved the workshops, and I kept taking playwriting classes because I was trying to like be a fiction writer, but like not rock the boat. And all my plays were just like full of monologues, like internal states. I mean, it just made, they were like pieces of fiction with actors being like, here's my 7-page speech. So they didn't really work as plays. And it was only post-college, kind of continuing to take writing classes, continuing to find myself reinterested in it, that a friend of mine got an MFA, and I could allow myself the envy of the MFA, and I just felt like, oh, that sounds amazing. What I want is an MFA, but I couldn't say I want to be a writer. It was too loaded. And then I went and got an MFA at UC Irvine, and that was a wonderful experience, and it was there that sort of all this drive kind of rushed in, where I suddenly felt like, actually, this is what I want, and that I could tell my sister and we could figure it out, and she could be her kind of writer and I could be my kind of writer, and really there's plenty of room. And I do think writers run in families, so I wouldn't be surprised if many of you have other people in your families who write as well. I think it might be a gene. Or you might be the outlier, right? And it's like there's no writers in your family and there's you, but then there'll be like some cousin off somewhere who'll show up and you'll be like, yes, Virginia Woolf. So for me it was very kind of like tentative for a very long time, but at the same time, even while it was tentative, emotionally I kept taking the classes because I loved workshops, and I kept writing because I loved writing. So it was almost like I was doing it without acknowledging what I was doing. And so when those two things kind of lined up, there was a real search for
what made you what draws you to fiction out of all types of prose? Because you said you explored playwriting, and we all have explored analytical writing, but
right.
Why fiction?
Right, and it's true, like I think there's always this interesting thing, which is no other art form do we learn an analytical skill also, right? It's not like painters have like their essay that they painted, right? They have their painting and that's their medium. But with writing, I think we do have this split between the medium that we use to think and to talk and to analyze, and this same one that you're picking to use to create. And often they can be really at odds. Like analytical papers took me a much longer time. I was always so helped when teachers would allow space to say, you can write a story for your reflection on Lord of the Flies or whatever, because then I would be like, okay, I know how to think about it more through storytelling. And so, but I think for fiction, I would say, for me, I think what's so exciting about fiction, and there's such a beautiful surge right now in nonfiction, so there's all this amazing nonfiction, and they sometimes, I think there's this question, like Zadie Smith wrote this wonderful essay this week sort of in defense of the idea of fiction and the imaginative leap into another character, which is great. But I think it's just that fiction is flexible in a way that I think maybe practically any other art form is, in that, on the page. And a poem can do this too, but I feel like a poem is, I still feel like storytelling allows you that space between what's personal and what's totally invented very freely. And certainly poets do that too, but I think fiction has total free reign on that. It also has free reign on time. You can collapse time. You can write a story that's about 10 seconds and expand it. You can also span millennia in a paragraph. Like, you just have that space. Historically, you can delve into wherever you want. You can put things right up next to each other. You can also, you have no budget, so you can really like go for it in terms of whatever magical leap you want to make. You don't have to worry about like stunt people, or right, in a play you don't have to worry about like the Peter Pan string where someone's flying. Like, people can do anything. Or like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, like in 100 Years of Solitude, he's just throwing these images at you over and over again, and they're all so incredible, and you get to just lavish in the feeling of these images on the page. And so I feel like fiction is extremely free in that way, and that's something I love about it, and something that I feel really strongly about, because we don't want to constrain it. There's a certain kind of short story model, and that short story model can be like a certain realistic short story with the epiphany or whatever, but there's also been a lot of pushback on that, and this idea that the short story has so many different shapes and forms. And I think, really at this point it's so easy to get exposed to a range of styles, but I think that's so thrilling, really, that when you get exposed to these different styles of short stories, you're like, what can this form do, and what can I can really try anything here. It may not work, but I can certainly try.
I think with fiction, you have to really embrace that childhood mindset of really embracing creativity and not rational thought, going into the irrational.
Yes.
So when you
Yes.
approach writing,
That's right.
where do you draw inspiration from, and how do you commit, how do you get these ideas that you're mulling in your head onto the page in this way, this beautiful way?
I mean, I think my general sense is that we tend to have a lot of ideas. They're just like tucked below the surface, and that the main thing is to try to access them and to create situations so that you have easier access to this sort of unconscious soup where you're processing everything. It's the kind of world of dreams, but that you can, how do you bring it up onto the page and shape it and form it and craft it so that you have something that you can then give to a reader and hopefully affect and move them. So for me, it's a lot about like this idea of sort of, using the form of a joke. So there's the joke of the guy goes to the doctor and says, you have a week left to live or whatever, and then it's usually like one more line. The doctor, I don't even know the real joke. But like it's sort of like, da-da-da, walked into a bar, or there's a, whatever. And so something to kind of narrow the field, I think, can be a way to start to access these layers below the surface. Another thing I really believe in is time limitation. So when I started grad school, I set a limitation on how much time I wanted to write. It was like, started with an hour and a half, and the rule was just stay there for an hour and a half. And by getting really antsy, but not being able to do anything but sit there, ideas started to bubble up, and ideas that weren't planned ideas, weren't expected things. So I think, and like you see sort of different writers' approaches about how do you like get yourself to a different space. I was reading Toni Morrison's interview in the Paris Review, and she talked about waking up before the sun and having a cup of coffee. There was something about the ritual of having the cup of coffee before the sun rose that felt like she was honoring a space that was like pre-thinking in a certain way, so that then she would go into the work, and it created this sort of liminal space. And it was with the interviewer that she was like, I guess this really did do something, because it was really always important to me to finish, or to have that coffee poured, or to finish it, I can't remember which one it was, before there was light outside. So I guess it feels like, what are these ways we can sort of create a space that feels slightly different than our normal space that we live in, that you can create in. So for me, like I said, it's really nice to have a set block of time and to be really rigid about it. So like I'll sit down and I'll write down my stopping time, and I'll stop at the stopping time. But some people like to do a certain amount of notes, or they'll do like, I'll do a writing exercise, or whatever it is. So I feel like maybe I lost the thread of the question, but I think it's just this idea of you're not, maybe this is the key point of it. We get in our own way all the time, and how do you clear yourself out of your own way a little bit? Because the critic comes in, the judge comes in, that gets in the way of exploring. It doesn't mean it gets in the way of your most amazing work. It just means you're trying to explore. And in the exploring, eventually you get to things that are surprising to you, and that tends, in my mind, to be the richer work. So how do you tuck away that critic for a little while and just...
Do you sit down pretty much every day, or how often do you sit down and take out this time to really write?
5 mornings a week.
5 mornings a week?
Yeah. And it's always, and this is related to being here, it's always before I teach, which feels really important too, so that by the time I'm in front of a classroom teaching, my own writing has happened. And that's, I think, generally helpful. Because once you're talking about it, and in this space, for me, it's a much more extroverted space. It's much more like dynamic and interactive and very different than like, whatever that sort of writer headspace is, so.
And then, okay, another question: who's inspired your work? Do you have any favorite writers? And
many.
Many.
Sort of like, and there's some sort of new ones. I was on a Sigrid Nunez kick this summer because I read The Friend, which is this beautiful, beautiful short novel, which is a lot about writing actually and about connection. And so then I wanted to read more of her, and so I was kind of like just on a little kick of reading her for the summer. And then when Toni Morrison died, I know I'm on a Toni Morrison like reread and reading, and so like that's sort of my current readership, which is exciting. And I'm reading a bunch of short story collections for like a judging contest thing, so that's pretty fun. I can't say any of those, but it's just fun to be reading those. And then there's also, like, I feel like there's a huge bedrock of writers that kind of moved outside of realism that have been really helpful to me. So like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, like Italo Calvino, who has this book Cosmocomics that I discovered when I was in college. A friend pointed out to me, which is basically narrated from the point of view of like a math equation about the beginning of the universe. And each chapter starts with like a statement about like how the earth was forming, and then he just goes into this absurdist rant from like this like the name is like 7 letters that don't have a vowel and like are there, and that's the sort of equation who's narrating. It's just so charming. It's so deeply charming. Some of you may know him from Invisible Cities, which is also a great one. And Haruki Murakami was then a writer that sort of came into my view and who I feel like I look to a lot as a guide. Writers like Angela Carter, who took fairy tales and subverted them in this incredible way. And like, Donald Barthelmé, like these sort of writers that kind of were going against what I feel like felt to me like the more traditional format for realistic fiction. Then of course when you look at like like finally when I got around to carefully reading Great Gatsby, because at first I was just like read it really badly and then hated it in concept, and then read it carefully and was like, oh, it is really like freshly and beautifully written. Like the people that love it, they love it for good reason. I can see how it's beautifully made. But I can also say, even though I can see how it's beautifully made and how I'm learning from it, that it's not lighting me up inside the way some of these other writers are, because it doesn't take the swerves are more subtle, and I think I respond to a larger swerve. That's just sort of like emotionally where I respond.
And speaking of lighting you up inside, I think, I think we all have motivations to find meaning and purpose in our work, and for many of us that's writing. And what about writing gives you a sense of purpose? Why does it light you up inside? Have you considered like that existential piece?
Love it.
Yeah.
Love the existential piece, and I think there's a bunch of responses I have to that. I think one main one goes beyond writing too, which is that I think one of my strong sort of beliefs is that process is sort of the thing. Like the more processes you can engage in, the more sense of purpose you gain, because it's when things are connected to quick product that they feel thin and they don't feel gratifying. So this is in relationships to people, whoever, right? It can be a romantic relationship, but it's also friendships, and it's also family members that you can have a complex and meaningful relationship with. That process changes over time, and that's really powerful and meaningful. It's any art form that you take on. It's any sort of internal work that you do. Like these processes, I think, become really enriching. So I feel like what writing does is it sort of kicks your ass, and that it's like sometimes really fun, and then it's sometimes a pain in the ass, and then you get better, and then you get like plateau for a while, and then that feels terrible, but then it changes again. And I think that teaches a lot of sort of resilience about seeing, not taking seriously the highs and lows. Like I have journals where I'll be like, I'm done writing. I've said everything I need to say. I don't think I have anything left. This sucks, I feel really sad about it, and I guess my writing career is over. And then 3 days later, it says, I started this new story, and I really like it, and I'm happy about it. And that's happened 4 times. I can find these journal entries, they are now locatable. And to see that, and then to know that feeling oh, I'm done, or feeling oh, I'm a terrible writer, is just part of the writing rhythm, is greatly relieving. And then I think you get to engage in this process where you're oh, and that also means maybe there's a surprise coming up around the corner. Maybe there are these unexpected things happening. I mean, if I think about that story, part of the point of that story is that the guy has some sort of set sense of what his life is going to be, and he has this sort of dark end for himself. And then he feels like he's going to die anyway, so then he actually opens up to the world. And then he dies anyway, but we're all going to die anyway. So it just feels like there's something in that sense of can we have some space for the surprises and things on the page, and can working on the page and being open to the surprises and things perhaps create space for us to be open to that in life, because that's hard. I think we do get a little bit locked into viewing the world a certain way. So that's and I could go on. I just feel like it's just meaningful to sort of commit to the thing that you're working on and see it through, even if you're not happy with how it comes out as a product, and to really shift away from this idea that the product is the thing that matters, because it ultimately really isn't,
Right. It's the process. And what about teaching? As a professor, do you find, how do you find meaning in that piece to your work as well?
Well, it's so fun, right? It's fun to talk about all this stuff. The students are wonderful. I just feel constantly inspired and invigorated and challenged by the classroom setting, and also how to make a workshop that feels like it works, and so that people want to create, and the sense of what are the things getting in the way, and how can I help create a tone that might make people want to take risks on the page and try something they haven't done before. That feels exciting to me. And that it is essentially a dynamic form, a workshop. The workshops that I didn't like as a student and that I don't want to lead are the ones that feel like there's a sort of checklist of craft questions only, where it's the one I always reference is is there a gesture for enough lines of dialogue? Can we just check these things? Does the point of view fit? Or just things that feel sort of moving away from the kind of feel of the whole piece, and the discussion that is murkier and muddier, but yet more fully engaged with what this person is bringing in, that is a piece in progress. It's a very weird enterprise workshop because the piece is in progress. It's not our story, and yet we're talking about it pretty openly. So I like that weirdness. I feel like that's an interesting challenge. And I think when it's working really well, then hopefully the writer leaves with new thoughts about revision and how to go back in, and doesn't feel, too disheartened, but also feels like they got some constructive, useful commentary. And it's interactive, it's social, and writers aren't, when you're writing, you're not social, and it's good to interact with people. That's a place in our lives as writers, right?
And as you're speaking to a group of undergraduates, so when you were an undergraduate, if you could tell yourself anything, I think we're in a room of people who are aspiring to be a writer, who are inspired by writers, or inspired by you. What would you tell them as some pieces of advice for their writing and committing to writing?
Let me think. I mean, I was so anxious as an undergrad about just what the future held. I was anxious about it constantly. It was terrifying, and I was preoccupied by that a lot. And I guess I wish I could have had a little more faith in the flow of things, and that if you try to sort of hang in there with yourself and get help as needed, things do kind of shift and change, and you get older, and things but to have a little more hope, I think I just felt like I needed to make decisions right away, and I needed to know everything right away, and I didn't know it, so I was sort of forcing the knowing, which feels terrible. And I think what I did know is I liked taking writing classes, and I needed to get a job. basically what, as a senior, when I graduated, I was like, I need to get a job, and I want to keep taking writing classes, and that was kind of all I could know, and to feel like it's shocking to me that I'm a professor at a college. It was not in the plan. It's fantastic, but it was not like, I was not, this is my goal, and da-da-da-da-da. I was really drifty and really unsure. And I have plenty of ambition and drive, but I didn't really know how to focus it. So, and I definitely did a bunch of therapy, so not to say that wasn't a factor, because it totally was. But I think, for me then to get, I got a job teaching elementary school because it was at a private school in San Francisco, and you didn't need a credential, which was shocking at a private school. And this was when San Francisco was totally affordable. It was like a million years ago. And then I got the job, and I kept writing, and it was like the patterns kept forming. Like sometimes someone will come into my office and be like, I feel like if I don't focus super intensely on the writing, I'll stop writing, or it'll go away. And I think it is sort of that wise old saying about if you love something, you gotta let it go and see if it comes back to you, which is if the impetus is there to keep writing, you will kind of just do it in your own way, and your own, you don't have to hammer it down. Or people that are like, I have to get an MFA instantly, I always feel like, well, why? Because the MFA is precious and it's short. And so does it have to be right away, or can you wait a little bit and live in the world and gain some material and then go? Because the people that were in my MFA that were just out of college, I think had the toughest time, actually, because I think it was over and they were 23, and that was nothing, right? So, and you still have to have contact with the abyss at 23. The abyss of just not knowing is there. And I think to everyone, to take on a major that is not something that leads obviously and directly to a job is scary. But I think it's also wonderful because you have allowed yourself the space to then think about things and read deeply and think deeply and make, and all of that is going to serve you. But it just means it's messier and it's less clear, and you have to kind of tolerate a certain ambiguity for longer. But I also think we're kind of built to tolerate ambiguity for longer, because that's part of what reading is, and that's part of what writing is. So it's not like this is a group that lives in the clear cut, right? I just don't think you're drawn to creative writing if that's the way your mind always works. So, yeah. Once again, what would I say to myself? I would try to say to myself, just have some faith in yourself, and if you can try to look at the tree and feel the wind on your face, that would be nice. If you could take a breath and just be, yeah. And you could play it with yourself too, because I feel like you could project a future older self that could, this is an exercise people do it, write a letter to your younger self, but imagine writing a letter to yourself now. I feel like you'd probably know what you need to tell yourself.
And MFA programs.
Yeah.
So I know I've talked to some friends. So I'm a senior, and a lot of the people who are on the e-board and Literary Society are considering MFA programs.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else has thought about MFA. But I loved your advice on not rushing into things and just kind of seeing what happens.
Yeah.
And also I think MFAs, they just push you to write. They give you a lot of structure, but when you graduate, you're gonna need to make it. You're not gonna be in school forever. So
yeah.
What's your opinion and advice about an MFA and for us?
I mean, I loved it. I loved my time in the MFA, but it was helpful to have waited and to really, really want it. And it was the first time I chose schooling in my life, because for me, college was and I think it's in some ways helpful for people when college is something that they are picking more, because I think your experience in college is a little bit different. And for me, it was sort of that's the thing that you do. And so I was less conscious about it as a choice. And so while I was there, I sort of did the best I could with that. But I think the MFA in graduate school was the first time I was like, this is not a necessity. So I am picking. This is something I really want. And I was much more present for that experience. But if you can wait, if you're really, really jumping at the bit and you feel like your writing is ready to go and you're just so ready and you need this time, there's a great program, all of that, then I think great. But if you feel like, if you have a nagging suspicion that the reason you're applying to an MFA now is because the idea of graduating is terrifying her, because you want to answer Aunt Sue when she asks you at Thanksgiving, you know, what the plan is, and what kind of writer, and are you going to sell a bestseller, and whatever, these annoying questions. Then I think it doesn't give the MFA credit, because I think it's very precious. It's short, and it's wonderful to be around people that value writing like you do, and it's just sort of a more intensified version of what you already are having, and you can't get two, you know, like you just have the one, and also your writing will likely get better in a couple of years, and you also will learn things about yourself as a writer. So I think there's a great benefit to waiting.
Do you still explore other art forms in your everyday? Are you stuck with writing, or because I'm such a creative soul, and I think that everyone in this room, we're humans, we're all creative, we're creative beings,
right.
And sometimes like we get stuck in our little silo of whatever our creativity is, but I think that to put a cap on something at such especially even we're young, we could, when we're 90 we could explore a new art form,
right,
but like
true, people change.
I mean, what is your approach to exploration around creativity and write, even more than writing?
I mean, great. I think some people tend to be sort of more, it's, what is it? It's like the fox and the other creature. It's not the hound though. It's like there's like you dig deep, and then one is breadth and one is hedgehog and the fox. Yes, yeah. And then, of course, I don't even know which one is. So who goes deep is my zoological. Which hedgehog goes deep?
The fox ranges around, and the hedgehog is smaller, so I assume it's like stays where it is.
Good. Thank you. Excellent. So I feel like there's this, and it's not, because I think you can go deep when you're going into different ones too, but I think that some sort of sensibilities naturally lean towards different art forms, and some are like writing is the thing, and I feel like it's all fine. And I think for me I would kind of experiment with other things. I wrote a lot of songs on my guitar in college, but they were okay. They were all kind of sad breakup songs. They were very helpful with the breakups. I would just play them over and over. But I think at different times, different things. My mom taught modern dance at SMC for 40 years. She finally had to retire because she's 80. And she's taken up painting, because painting you can do with an 80-year-old body. Like, it just feels like, and that's amazing to see, because you just see how, like, I see how she's very nonverbal in kind of her artistic endeavors, and so it's shifted to another nonverbal art form. But I think for me, when I started with this sort of block of time and made it about writing, what happened was something did get funneled, and I felt like part of the pleasure of the set amount of time was that as soon as I was done, like, I could put the creative energy there, and then I could go like attend to the lists and like check off the things I needed to do and do whatever are the more practical things. And so because of that, like some of that, what I had before I had that set time, there would be a more kind of free-flowing, I think, creative energy. And it would be, I'd put stuff all over my walls and da-da-da-da. And now I have kids, and now my kids have stuff all over the walls, and that's kind of interesting to see too. But I feel like it's shifted for me. But I welcome that. It's actually been all right.